Good morning, everybody. This is Wayne Trammell. We will be starting in about 2 minutes. This is your 2-minute warning. Jessica Brown will take over as close to the top of the hour as we can. There are a lot of people joining, but we will try to get started as close to on time as possible. Please know that the Q&A tab is available to you if you want to put questions in there. We'll actually be using that during the presentation, and we will get started shortly. Thanks for joining us. The next voice you hear will not be mine, but it will be Jessica's. Enjoy the webinar.
Good morning. My name is Jessica Brown. I am a marketing manager here at Communispond, and I'll be your host today. We are recording today's session, and following the conclusion of the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the recording and also the slides. We will be projecting our webcams throughout the webinar. If you don't see our streaming webcams currently, just expand the Participants tab in the upper right portion of your screen. And we are very interested in taking your questions. There is a Q&A icon in the upper right portion of your screen, so please just select that icon to submit your questions. Throughout the webinar, we'll answer as many as we can towards the end. So let's get started. At the end of today's session, we'll be drawing names of our prizes. For our prizes, we'll be giving away an Android tablet and also 2 gift certificates, each good for a seat in executive presentation skills, public seminar. And the gift certificate can also be used as a $1,550 credit towards a corporate program. And if you are not familiar with Communispond, Communispond has been the leader in professional skills training for 47 years. Also, Communispond offers solutions in 5 core competencies: communication performance solutions, leadership skills, sales performance solutions, executive communications coaching, and business skills solutions. And Communispond has a strong global presence with 12 offices worldwide, 75+ global faculty, and delivering programs in over 19 different languages. Now I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Wayne Trammell. Wayne is a longtime Communispond faculty member and an expert in communication and presentation skills, particularly as they apply to the online world. He's the author of several books on the subject, including 10 Steps to Successful Virtual Presentations and Meet Like You Mean It. We'll actually be giving away 2 copies of Meet Like You Mean It at the end of today's webinar. And especially appropriate for our purposes today, Wayne is the writer of the very popular blog, theconnectedmanager.com. Wayne, I will now turn the podium over to you. Oh, sorry.
Under Jessica, we can actually do that. Okay, Jess, you need to right-click on my name and change my role to presenter, please. In the meantime, we will get started. I am going to welcome you all from Chicago. Also, maybe more importantly, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions which will help us target our comments today. So I'm going to actually use the polling tool, and if you would be kind enough to answer the following, which is, why are you interested in today's topic? Is it because you manage a remote team? Is it because you're a member of a remote team? Maybe both, and that's an important number, by the way, to know that. Or do you work in the office, but you support remote teams? And we'll give people just a chance to vote. We'll remind you that your questions are being answered, so get them in queue as we go. We have just a couple of more seconds here to let people continue voting. We're getting some interesting results, and we'll be sharing those results in about 10 seconds. Also, for those of you who have been on Communispond webinars before, you probably noticed that we're using a new platform, and hopefully that will make connection easier and ultimately make everything work. So let's take a look, and you'll see that for the most part, just about, well, over half of you are either members of a remote team or you both manage and are members of a remote team, and that's an important number. Now I'm going to ask you a second question, which is, how's the level of communication between the team members on your team? Not just between the manager and the individual, but between the team members themselves. And again, we're going to give you just a couple of seconds to answer that effectively. And the answers are piling in. Those of you who thought this was one of those put your phone on mute and go answer your email kind of deals are going to be a little surprised. We're also using the Q&A tab to get some of your comments as we go. So we'll give this just another few seconds. We'll close the poll. Takes about, 15 seconds or so to close. And in the meantime, we will get started. Also, a reminder that we are recording this webinar. When the webinar is over, you'll get a link to the recording as well as a chance to download the visuals if that's what you want to do. So let's share the results real quick and see that about a third of us say that it's not as good perhaps as we'd like, and it's okay given the circumstances. There are only about 13% who say that the level of communication between team members is really good, and that's an important number. So let's close that for the moment. You can close the polling question just so it doesn't get in the way. And let's talk about what we're going to cover during our time together. We're going to discuss how remote workers are impacting the workplace, why communicating over distance is difficult, but it's not impossible, how technology helps the team work together, or not, as the case may be. And throughout, you'll get practical tips to help team leaders, project managers, and individual team members cope better in this working environment. So, we've had complaints about virtual working for a while. We're going to spend some time talking about the real world. And I really want you to think about this. Leadership has always been leadership. I am so sorry, excuse me. The great leadership expert Peter Drucker said that, not much has changed. The greatest management job of all time was building the pyramids, and we've just been trying to live up to that high standard ever since, which is true, except, of course, that the guy who built the pyramids was actually at the pyramids. He wasn't trying to flog people by email. And research kind of backs this up. I mean, we've always had remote teams. Genghis Khan ruled half the known world and never held a webinar. But there are some statistics that are worth paying attention to. According to PMI, the Project Management Institute, about 85% of projects, and I suspect that number is low, are conducted with at least one team member who isn't located with everybody else. That's a pretty significant number when you think that 60+% of capital expenditures are on projects. U.S. Department of Labor, managers above direct supervisor, again, over 80%, have at least one team member who doesn't work where the rest of the team does. And as for managers, almost 90% of managers are part of a virtual team. In other words, even if the people we manage are in one location, our colleagues may be scattered around on a regional basis, for example, and not located where we are. Think about how that's changed the way we work over the last few years. The fact of the matter is that if you ask anybody, managing remotely is, or at least appears, more difficult than just doing it the way we've done it. And let's think about two things. Number one is, it's not like we've always done a great job of leadership, even when we are all gathered together. And secondly, it's not getting any easier anytime soon. If you look at a lot of the research, not only from the U.S. Department of Labor, but MIT, Harvard, a bunch of the research says that collaborating virtually will be a core skill in the future going forward, and I would humbly submit that that ship has already sailed. Some of those studies predicted that, by 2017, this is going to matter. I think it matters now. I think that the move to a virtual, a dispersed, or if you've got half and half, what we call a hybrid work environment, is already here, and we need to get our mitts around it. So, what are some of the things that make working remotely challenging? And since so many of us on this call wear two hats, we are both a manager and a member of a remote team, right? Not only the people that we manage, but our peers and colleagues are remote from us. I want you to wear both the manager and the employee hat for just a moment. As we look at what's going on with managers, number one complaint, we don't know what's really happening out there. And it's not that we are micromanaging weasels for the most part. I think there are a few out there. But the fact is, we can't help if we don't know what's going on. It's a very, very difficult thing. It requires a lot of trust. It is trust that's easily shaken, which we'll discuss in a bit. A lot of managers say, I just don't have the personal connection to my remote team members that I have to the people in the office. As telework becomes more and more a factor in our lives, that's going to become something that we need to get our mitts around. I know that when I managed Communispond's faculty, we had 40 instructors scattered around the world, and I had to make some decisions where to spend my energy. And what I did was I tended to work on out of sight, out of mind. Very often we deal with kind of the fires that are burning at the moment and assume that the workers are professionals. They know how to reach me. My door is always open, virtually or otherwise. And that's great. But you can imagine that I had my share of unpleasant surprises as we went. And so over time, this can create a real lack of trust. Now, I want you to put your employee hat on. And I want you to see that there are similar challenges, and yet they work differently. The biggest complaint from employees is they're disconnected from the big picture. They don't hear the hallway conversations. They don't see what's going on. And so they tend to focus inward. And one of the interesting things that we're discovering about teleworkers, people who work remotely, compared to the people in the office, their task completion, the number of tasks that they accomplish, is actually higher because they kind of develop tunnel vision and they're not distracted. The problem, of course, is that because they're lacking some of that big picture information, they're maybe the last to hear news, they don't always have the work information that they need to get the job done to its highest quality. So they get stuff done. Frequently, there's rework involved and other things. One of the big complaints is that they don't receive consistent feedback from their managers like they did when they were in the office. And what's interesting about that is, they get the negative feedback. When something's wrong, there's no problem communicating. What they don't get is the everyday positive affirmative communication. one of the big discrepancies for remote workers, and this may be a question of perception, is that they're losing out on chances for reward and promotion. If you look at the studies, HR and managers think we do a pretty good, fair job of evaluating people and such, but the perception for the people who work remotely is that the folks at home office get first dibs on all the good jobs. Over time, there can be a feeling of disrespect. If you have been the person dialing into the conference room and you can't get a word in edgewise and nobody can hear what you're saying, you know that over time you can feel a little bit disrespected. And what's interesting is that remote workers are reporting they work really hard to have a good relationship with their immediate boss. What's lacking is very often the communication to the teammates around them and a lack of trust in their fellow team members. And we'll take a look at more of that in just a moment. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to click the Q&A box if you haven't already. And I would absolutely love it if, while we're talking, you would write down what are some of your challenges as a member of a virtual team, and we'll respond to those as we go through the webinar. So just click the Q&A box, write in the box what are some of your challenges as a manager or a member, and we'll include those in our conversation as we go. Okay, while I'm waiting for some of those to trickle in, I want you to be aware of when we're talking about the lack of trust. What happens very often is you wind up with communication that looks like a bicycle wheel. You know, if we take a look at this, you can see that the manager is in the middle of the conversation and, oh, you know, everybody seems to be working really hard to communicate with the manager, but you'll see that what happens, and somebody just mentioned joining up activities between members, is, you know, Arnie isn't maybe connected to Betsy, and Betsy isn't speaking to Carlos, who isn't necessarily talking to Diane, and so the manager then bears the brunt of that communication, and if you're getting swamped, getting CC'd on emails, if you're getting requests from your team that maybe should be directed to team members, that may be a sign that that's happening. You know, when you wind up, when you have a lack of trust with a lot of rework, the manager bears the brunt of that, and you get a lot of self-protective behavior, CYA for a better term. And as I look at the challenges, we're seeing things like time zones, the remote people being heard, which can become both a technology challenge and a, what's the word I'm looking for, a facilitation leadership challenge as well. How do you celebrate as a team? You know, there's unequal preparation. Some people are prepared, some people aren't. Out of sight, out of mind, I feel you there. And it's difficult to hear things that are said. So you'll notice that there is a mix of specifically technology challenges, right? If we can't join, if we can't hear, that's a problem. But there's also facilitation and leadership things which maybe aren't part of that. And somebody mentioned, Jesus actually just said that his challenge is he's the only one in the division in his particular role. And that leads to an interesting piece of terminology. So I want to make sure that we're distinguishing between remote teams and what we call virtual teams. Remote distance, according to Karen Sobol-Wojcicki, who's a professor at SUNY Stony Brook, remote distance is we're all on the same team, but we're scattered, right? It's physical distance. We're connected, we're all working for the same reason, and yet, you know, if we work hard, we can use tools, technology, hard work, kind of brute force to make it work. Genghis Khan, right, managed to rule the world without a webinar. On the other hand, there's what we call virtual distance, which is not only physical, but also emotional and psychological. For example, there are studies out now that the further you sit from somebody, the more remote you feel. If you sit in the same cube farm, if you're within a 30-yard radius of your team members, there's a 90% chance that you will have direct communication with those people during the day. As you move to 50 yards and more, maybe same floor of the office, but a different physical space, that number drops. And if you're on a different floor than people you work with, even if you're in the same building, you may as well be on the other side of the world for the amount of actual contact that you have with them. Virtual distance is a real problem on project teams. Jesus's point about being the only person in his department and yet having to work on project teams and things like that is an example where we may be working on the same team. There's a project manager, but we have different bosses, different reporting relationships. And so that creates problems on top of just actually staying connected. So it's that psychological distance that really creates the difference between the way we've always led and the way that we have to now. It can only be overcome by lots of communication and, more importantly, thoughtful, purposeful communication that is designed to build trust. And as a couple of people mentioned in the chat, how do you sell ideas? How do you influence? How do you do all that? And it starts with building trust. So this is kind of a distillation of a bunch of famous trust models. But there are three things that have to be in alignment in order for trust to exist. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a remote team, a regular team, or even our personal relationships. The first step is, do we have a common purpose? Are we all pulling together for the same reason? Those things really matter. I would warrant that most of us try to do a good job of this. There's a company mission. The team is reminded of what they're doing. Project teams have a charter that they start with. Over time, as new people join, as experienced people develop habits and kind of thought processes, as we run into priority problems with different managers, that can suffer. But generally speaking, we do a pretty good job, and it doesn't matter whether we're co-located or not. The other two are really affected seriously by working remotely. The first of those is competence. I can't trust my team members if I don't believe they're competent, if I don't think they're good at their job. And when I see somebody every day, when I see Melinda working at her desk hard, even if she never speaks up in meetings, I see how hard she works. I know that she is the company expert on such and such. And I just know that because I know her and I've known her for a while. If I don't work with her and she's just a voice on a conference call and she never speaks up, and the only time I did hear from her, she missed the deadline, I may draw some very harsh conclusions based on a very small data set. That's the problem with working remotely. I have no proof that that person is competent. And even if they're competent, are they motivated? Are they as strongly motivated as I am? If I ask somebody for help, if I send an email and I don't get an answer right away, am I not getting that answer because they're busy, because they're actually planning a good response, or do they not care? The problem is when we work remotely, we don't know. Very often we send emails and wait responses from people who physically aren't even in the office because we have no way of knowing, and yet we can ascribe motives to that depending on how well we work together. So if common purpose, competence, and motives aren't in alignment, it's really, really difficult to build trust. If the only time you hear from the team in Dallas is when they miss a deadline, Dallas always misses its deadline. If you've never met the folks in Poland, are you willing to reach out to them to ask a question, or are you going to go to the team members that you already know? Span of control is a real issue. Do people feel comfortable? Do they trust that you will address their problem or help them out without having secret hidden agendas? All of those things can create problems. If the teams don't pull together, then individuals on the team aren't engaged the way that they should be. They're not willing to put out the extra effort for each other. Interestingly enough, studies show that remote workers who are not engaged tend to be more ripe for turnover, being picked off by headhunters. If they have no emotional stake in the company, if they don't care about their coworkers, if they don't have a good working relationship with their manager, a job's a job. And that becomes an issue in lots of ways: missed deadlines, lower productivity, and ultimately costs. Any cost savings from telework can be eaten up by rework, poor performance, turnover, all of those things. So at the end of the day, how do we go about building the kind of working relationships that get people engaged, that have people give the discretionary effort that they need in order to overcome the distance? Because you know as well as I do, it can be overcome and it takes a lot more work. Well, if they're not willing to put that work in, you're going to have trouble. So what builds work relationships? Well, first of all, we need evidence of common purpose, competence, and motives. So does the team have enough proof of each other's competence, motives, and alignment that they can feel comfortable working with those folks? That's a really crucial question. How do I know that the team in Dallas is good at their job? When we work together, we do that through frequent interaction. So the more interaction we have with our remote teammates, the better data set we'll have to work from, the more comfortable we'll be working with those folks. And it's different than friendship. We do not necessarily have to be best buddies with people in order to trust and like them. Interestingly enough, we were talking about costs. The costs really do matter. 2/3 of capital expenditures in this country are based on projects. 70% of projects are considered failures by the people who pay for them. We're talking about real consequences here. So this is not hypothetical, and this is what keeps managers up at night. So we need proof of motives. We need constant interaction, all that stuff. The problem, of course, is that we don't see each other at work every day. We don't have the hallway conversations. We don't, throw Nerf balls over the wall at each other and all the things that help create working relationships. Frequent interaction would be a beautiful thing if it were possible, but I can't see you slaving away at your desk. Managers can't just come by, poke their head over the cubicle like a meerkat and see what people are working on, or are they spending all day on Facebook. Conference calls are maybe the most common way that we communicate, and they are terrible for making sure that you get lots of participation for both technical and social dynamic reasons. However, here's the thing. Technology, if it's used correctly and used thoughtfully, can help bridge those gaps. The problem is we don't think purposefully very much about the tools that we use. We've kind of been thrown in the deep end and we're scrambling around to use them. We need to stay connected. There's no other option. Think about how many tools we actually have at our disposal. Even if you don't have the absolute latest and greatest, we have a ton of tools at our disposal. The telephone, of course, has changed things, but forever. And now with mobility, we can hear each other's voices. We can communicate in real time. We can send written messages through the phone now. Very, very useful tool. Web meetings. Somebody just mentioned in the Q&A Google Hangouts and video chats, and that they like those better than a conference call. And I'll tell you why you like them more in just a moment. But the ability to add a visual component, the ability to see who we're talking to, goes a long way. Asynchronous tools like shared files and blog sites, SharePoint, Google Docs, things like that, help teammates demonstrate competence even across time zones. Even when we're not there together, I can see the other person's work and I can see the quality of the work that they do, which is really critical. And then there are tools like instant messaging and chat, which are, fast and dirty, but get the job done and allow us to move on with our lives. The interesting thing is that most of us have never actually had the opportunity to think about what tools we're using. And I would bet that most of us have never had an explicit conversation about which tool do we use when. When do we pick up the phone? When do we send an email? When do we get face-to-face? When I was still at Communispond full-time, I uncovered some research from a European researcher named Bettina Buchel, who broke communication down to something really simple. And I love when we find a model that expresses a complicated thought really simply. Bettina came up with the notion that communication is a balance of richness versus scope. What does that mean? Well, if we think about rich communication, we're getting verbal, nonverbal, real-time communication. It's informal, it's honest, it's open. Face-to-face, you and I having a cup of coffee in the break room is as rich as communication gets. I can read your body language, your face, you can hear my tone of voice. I can tell when you're looking skeptical. Maybe you have a question, I can answer it in real time so it doesn't have a chance to fester. That's really important. Now, we all know, of course, that with time zones, time, space, and dimension, even as we add people to the conversation, that dynamic changes. And that puts us where we need scope as opposed to richness. A company-wide email, as an example, is great for scope. Thousands of people can get the same message at the same time, instantaneously. It's great. The only problem is that messages might be open to interpretation. Not everybody reads it the same way. It tends to be less than perfect. So, it's everything else falls somewhere in between there. Think about telephone conversations. Individual calls are very rich. We can still hear each other's voice. It's still real time. Conference calls tend to be less rich. They have a lot of people. The dynamic changes. The more people on the call, the less likely people are to speak up. The more people on the call, the more you're going to have technical challenges. If you look at web meetings, for example, and somebody mentioned that using webcams are better than the phone, well, this is the reason for a lot of folks. Web meetings allow us to do more. They allow us to have richer communication. The fact that you can see me, and if you click on the participants tab, if my webcam has gone away, the fact that you can see me, you've probably found more engaging. Human beings crave human content. The fact that we're all looking at the same thing, the fact that we can chat while we're doing this, even with a very large audience, we're making this as interactive and rich as experience as we can. Think about what it would be like trying to have this session today just on a conference call. So we have a lot of tools at our disposal. The trick is, are we using them as well as we might? And that matters because having a tool like Skype for Business or WebEx doesn't matter if you'd rather send an email. If you are the type of manager who is reluctant to have difficult conversations, it's really easy to manage by email. So having the tools is only half the battle. We need to choose them accordingly. And of course, in the virtual workplace, especially the global workplace, we have the interesting dynamic of synchronous and asynchronous tools. Synchronous tools is simply a fancy word for same time, same place. The telephone, webcams, IM and texting, it happens in real time. You bump into somebody in the hallway, that's a synchronous conversation. Asynchronous is across time and space. It's not all at the same time. So, you know, your people in Malaysia are probably reading that email at a different time than the people in the office in New York. By the way, I want you to notice something. Email is an asynchronous tool. IM is not. So if you're sending emails, drumming your fingers, waiting for an immediate response, you're using email wrong. That's an instant message function. Email was not designed to have us glued to it and responding immediately. So if I'm managing my email and not responding immediately, you may be sitting on the other side of the country, drumming your fingers, calling me terrible names. Does your team have an explicit agreement about what tools you use? How do you use them? When do you use them? When do you use IM? When do you use email? That's actually really difficult. If you're doing things like brainstorming, you want synchronous tools. You know, if all you're using is a conference call, probably not going to go real well. If you're using tools like WebEx or Skype for Business or whatever, and you're using the whiteboard, that's great, but there's also an asynchronous component. Maybe people have ideas afterwards that they want to add to the discussion. That's where things like SharePoint, blogs, wikis, shared documents come in, where even after the fact, people can share their brilliance, their competence, and their motives. So, you know, virtual meetings are a much richer way than simply conference calls. And I know that they have been a fascination of mine now for a number of years. And I guess the question is, are they painful or productive? And the answer is probably a little bit of both. If you've ever attended a web meeting, and this I don't consider a meeting, this is a webinar, this is a one-to-many broadcast event that we are making as rich as it can be given the circumstances. If this was a team meeting, your phone lines would be open, we'd be using the chat a lot more, things like that. There are ways that we can do it. If you've ever attended a virtual meeting that lacked interaction, you know how painful it can be. Well, there are some things that you can do. A good virtual meeting, for example, needs to be organized, it needs to be facilitated effectively, and it has a social component, which helps your team get to know each other. If it's all about business and there's no social component, people develop tunnel syndrome, and that's when the communication can break down between team members. So let's take a look at this in a little more depth. As I mentioned, a good virtual meeting is well organized. The purpose and outcome has been identified. And the best way to do that is with a clear agenda. If people show up and they don't even know why they're there, are we shocked that we're not getting really good, thoughtful input and participation? So an agenda is absolutely crucial. One of the ways to keep people engaged in a good virtual meeting is to start with the important stuff. How many meetings have you been on where you're busy taking care of all the administrivia and 1,000 little things, and by the time you get to the part of the meeting that requires input, energy, thoughtfulness, the meeting's almost over and you either run out of time or people are already thinking about their next meeting. The big thing in a virtual environment is that you have to plan for interaction. You can't just look across the table and see how horrified Pam looks, right? I can't look at Gwen and see that she's looking at me like I have 3 heads, so I can say, Gwen, you have a question. You need to plan that interaction. You can't just see somebody walking by and say, hey, Kate, how are you? It's very difficult to do. It requires planning and mindfulness that we're often not thinking about. We're too busy paddling, for lack of a better term. A good virtual meeting needs to be facilitated effectively. And that's crucial. You need to have a strategy to work effectively. But facilitating an online meeting is difficult. It uses a different set of muscles than just being in the conference room. You can't simply change on the fly, for example. You need to do some things. So you have to have a strategy worked out in advance. That includes things like setting ground rules for how the meeting's going to run. How's your team going to work? How are we with doing a lot of these things? If the team is experienced at working remotely, you may have to do less of that. But having everybody working under the same principles is really important. And you have to have a questioning strategy. You need to question proactively. How are you going to solicit feedback? Are you going to take things in chat? Are you going to open the microphones? Are you going to allow everybody to speak? Are you going to let people dominate? Or are you going to call on people that you need to hear from? All of that you need to be mindful of. Don't be afraid to go after people gently. There's a couple of things. One is that you want to set the expectation that people are expected to participate so you can hold them accountable for participating. In international companies where English is a second language is sometimes an option, are you allowing people to use the chat? For example, many people's written English is better than their spoken English. So maybe they would prefer to use the chat rather than try to get a word in edgewise. You know, in virtual meetings, it's sometimes hard to overcome the audio problems and things like that. You need to question in a way that gets people involved without putting them on the defensive, but also sets the ground rules about how you're going to work together. One way to do that is always to mention the person's name before you call on them. So, you know, Alan, you said you were at that meeting. Would you tell us about that? As opposed to tell us about it, Alan. Again, you want to be working from a place of trust. It's critical that the meeting leader, and in fact all the team members, know the platform's features. 80% of WebEx users use 20% of the features. As more of you are rolling out Skype for Business, I am stunned at how poorly people understand that there is nothing that WebEx or any of these other tools can do that Skype for Business can't do. And yet most people don't know about the whiteboard and the polling and those types of features. The meeting facilitator needs to know that those tools exist so that you can generate the best input. The problem is, if you're trying to lead the meeting, run the tools and everything else at the same time, it can kind of freak us out, and so we tend not to use them. A simple solution to that is have other people share the meeting responsibility. You know, if you're going to use the whiteboard, say, hey, Robin, do me a solid. Would you write on the whiteboard while I lead the discussion? That keeps your head in the game where it needs to be, not worrying about the tools. The example that I always use when it comes to that is if you have ever been driving late at night looking for an address in the rain and you've had to turn down the radio so you can see better, you've experienced what can go on. And finally, there's the social component. You need to build time for non-work interaction. Webcams are great for that. People instantly connect when they can put a face to a name. You know, consider using the webcams, especially for one-on-one and small group communication. You want to use the speakerphone or the camera as a participant, so you're making eye contact with people. There's lots of things that you want to do. You can share the meeting spotlight, for example, and give everybody a chance to be highlighted to the team so that you're getting that proof of competence and proof of motives, and everybody's seeing the quality of everybody's work. So yeah, use and maximize the tools. Now, the good news is that, you know, these darn kids today are actually pretty good at this. Where you've got a mixed team, some people in the meeting room, some people on the phone, bear in mind that that phone is another participant. Encourage their participation. Make sure that they can be heard. try starting with taking questions from the remote people as opposed to the people in the room. Too often we fall back on using our eyes to direct traffic and then, oh yeah, what about the rest of you? Don't be afraid to appoint a monitor around the speakerphone who can repeat the question, or if somebody in the room says something good, repeats it for the benefit of the people on the phone so that they're included, not an afterthought. The fact is, this is the first generation of workers coming into the workplace now who are technologically much more comfortable and much more literate with technology than their bosses. That didn't used to be the case. And so millennials are in the workplace. They're used to working collaboratively, developing relationships that the rest of us would consider virtual. And they're uniquely positioned to help the rest of us if we let them. But working remotely is an opportunity. It's not something to be feared. We just have to be realistic about it. So, collaborating with colleagues and clients around the world, it's frankly, it's the norm, not the exception. And we would love to be helpful to you and your organization in making it a little less painful for you. So I'm going to turn it back over to Miss Jessica now, who's going to drive.
Thank you, Wayne. Before I jump into the questions, I just wanted to say I hope all of you are enjoying the new platform. We moved over to using Cisco WebEx, and if any of you have been on our webinars in the past, you know that we are using a different platform, so this is a little bit of an upgrade, and you'll be using it moving forward, so I hope you guys have all been enjoying it. And if you haven't submitted your questions, please go down to the Q&A chat function or the chat function. I'll check both for your questions. And also I just wanted to mention too, if you're wondering who Logical Operations is, you see that name floating around throughout the platform a little bit. They are actually Communispond's sister company. They are a courseware provider globally. So yeah, we're sharing the platform with them. So that's who Logical Operations is. We work very closely with them. So without further ado, I'll jump into some of those questions. And thank you all for all that great feedback. I see there are a lot of questions out there, and a lot of people are struggling with the same thing with remote teams and working remotely and everything like that. So if I don't get to your question and you want to continue the conversation with a professional at Communispond, I encourage you to go to communispond.com, just click on the Contact tab, type in your question, say you're on the webinar and you still have a question, something like that, and if you want a professional to reach out to you and answer your question, please feel free to do that. We're here to help. So let me jump into some of those questions now. So a lot of them were around tips for working across, or looking for tips for working across time zones. So some people are saying people have to work or work at night or work early in the morning in order to accommodate those time zones. So what are some best practices for that?
Yeah, and this is a really complicated issue, and it needs to be addressed. And I think it needs to be addressed on a team-by-team basis. And here's why I say that. Well, we're a New York-based company, and I don't care that we're global. Headquarters is on Eastern time, and so everything's going to revolve around that. Well, that's great. It's efficient. You will probably find that it creates some problems for your remote workers and doesn't exactly endear yourself. One of the most powerful things you can do is switch meeting times around so that the people in Singapore aren't the ones always bearing the brunt of the time zone problem. And it's not just internationally. People in California get really tired of taking conference calls at 6 a.m. One of the things that really helps teams, and it's on that social level, is to move it around so that maybe every once in a while the people in New York have to miss the kids' soccer game in order to make the team meeting. It actually increases the amount of empathy and understanding of what other people go through. Particularly the people who are in the office, if they have to log on suffer the problems of, bad phone connections, missing lunch because that's the only time somebody can meet. It tends to help the team understand each other and be a little more sympathetic and empathetic with each other. Rotating time zones is really a best practice that the team needs to take a look at. It's not always practical based on customer demands and other things, but you need to look at it. The other thing is, do you really need to have a conference call or a web meeting when you could have the discussion online? Creating an FAQ is a great way to let everybody equally submit and show how smart they are. So take a look at some asynchronous ways of sharing the communication that might be equally important. And the recording on tools like WebEx or Skype is something that I would consider playing with.
Great, thanks, Wayne. Another very popular question that was coming up a lot, people that are remote members, or someone said, I'm a remote member of a team with most of the other members co-located, and I often feel left out. Do you have any suggestions for me talking to the manager, but wouldn't it sound like I'm complaining?
There's a difference between having an honest conversation and complaining. I mean, mom likes them more than she likes me is whining. Saying to your manager, everybody seems to get the news before I do. How can we be more proactive is a different situation. I think that, frequent check-ins, very often, we have weekly check-ins with our remote bosses, and that's frankly not enough. Some of us, I know that my boss back in the day, I much preferred frequent short communications. I'd rather have daily check-ins that lasted a couple of minutes than to sit in the dark for a week before I got an hour with her. Working remotely requires some flexibility and maybe a change in the way that we're working. Again, having everybody, rather than get everybody in the conference room and other people dial in, having everybody dial in from their desk at least once in a while helps everybody not only develop that empathy that we talked about a minute ago, but allows you to leverage the tools like polling and chat and webcams that might not be present in the conference room. So there are some very, and it's funny, if we stop to think about what's the real problem, the answers appear self-evident. But when was the last time we actually got a chance to stop and think about this stuff?
Excellent. Another person asked or said, celebration of success is tough when we work off-site. Any suggestions for how people can celebrate as a team working remotely?
There's a really excellent point there, and it goes to people being isolated. Managers in general try to remember, next time I'm talking to Jesus, I need to remember to congratulate him on X. The problem is the rest of the team doesn't hear that. So take time, whether it's in group emails, whether it's at the beginning of a meeting, to share those good news, attaboy, attagirl, congratulations, so that everybody on the team hears them. Me talking to Jessica and saying, Jessica, you did a really good job with that is great, but it helps the team when the team hears what Jessica did. So be mindful that if you're going to do the celebration, if you're going to do that, that you not only do it individually, but as a team. And, there may be times when it might be tempting to call the people who are in the office together and then share the news with the team, but try to do it as synchronously as you can. It really does make a difference. When you're constantly the last to know, over time that can have a corrosive impact on the team. And do it richly. Conference calls are great, webcams are better. Getting together is better still. Just because we're working remotely doesn't mean we can completely eliminate getting together at least once in a while. The bean counters are really fond of WebEx, and you need to use it properly.
Thank you, Wayne. And another challenge was those remote workers when they're balancing multiple things. So if somebody's working virtually, other people can't see that they have lots of people wanting to talk to that person, and any tips for that?
Yeah, it's that lack of visibility, right? If I stop by somebody's desk and I can see they're engaged in conversation or they're on the phone, I'll maybe let them know that I want to talk to them later or something and step away. The point is we don't know what's going on, and of course, if we're stressed and somebody doesn't respond to us, they hate us and they don't care and all kinds of horrible things get imagined. So set expectations around simple things like using your status updates. Both IM and email allow you to say, hey, I'm out of pocket for the next 4 hours. You know, I'll be answering emails at such and such a time. If it's critical, I'll go somewhere else. If it's not critical, at least I know not to sit there waiting for an answer that's not coming. If you are going to be out of the office for the day, does your team have an agreement about setting status updates? It's really important. A simple thing is using IM to confirm that somebody's there before you pick up the phone or leave a voicemail or send an email. We have to get used to using these tools. You know, in the office, I can look and see that somebody's busy. Virtually, I might send an IM and say, hey, do you have a minute? And if you say, not right now, but give me 15, I'm generally okay with that. So it requires a more mindful way of working, and yet at the end of the day, it serves the same function. We just need to be aware that the job we need to do hasn't changed. It's the way that we interact and how we use those tools that really has thrown a monkey wrench into things. We need to be much more mindful.
Great. So I'll squeeze in one more question. We are running out of time. So I know there are a ton of questions and comments. So like I said, please feel free to go to communispond.com and click on that contact tab. Just feel free to ask any questions there and someone will reach out to you to get your question answered. So the last question is, any tips for remote onboarding?
Onboarding is tough because the whole point of onboarding is not only to introduce the new employee to the company, get them up to speed, get them functional as quickly as possible, but also introduce the rest of the team to that new person. And so remote onboarding needs to be done very mindfully. And here are, I'll give you 3 things that are really important. The first is when you're working virtually, you can't do the same kind of sheep dip that you get when you call somebody into the office for 2 days for orientation. Orientation needs to be broken up over small chunks of information or you're just going to overload the person. Secondly, this is a great chance to help the team get to know each other by doing peer mentoring and arranging for Peter to be the person to teach the new guy about this, and Rajesh can teach the person about this, and so the team members get to know each other very quickly, and the newbie knows where they can go for help that isn't the manager. And the third thing is visual. Use your webcams as much as possible early on so that people see and get to know each other. Trust is enhanced immeasurably when you can put a face to a name. So that's 3 things that I would say about remote onboarding to help both the individual and the team.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Wayne. And to wrap up, just want to remind you that I will be emailing the winners of the Android tablet and the 2 gift certificates to the public seminar of executive presentation skills. And that concludes the webinar. I want to thank Wayne Turmel again for giving us some very valuable insights, and I hope all of you will join us for our next webinar. Thank you. Bye.